Roach. And I'm smiling, I'm happy, because I'm going to be exonerated.
The shovel stops on wood. Not stone. Not soil packed hard by time. A single sheet of plywood, laid deliberately over something someone wanted to disappear. Investigators clear the last of the dirt by hand. Beneath the board, in a grave that already holds another body, 3 more are waiting. Their wrists are bound behind their backs. One has ligature marks circling his throat. Another has a sock knotted tight against her neck. The medical examiner works the scene in silence, and when he finally speaks, he delivers a single finding that will outlast every appeal filed for the next 30 years. The injuries were not immediately fatal. All 3 were alive when the earth covered them. That finding reaches a jury, with no one in the room to challenge it, because the man on trial has no lawyer. The court has already dismissed 6. It denies a 7th. So he defends himself, alone, in a case where the only possible sentence is death. He is convicted on all 3 counts, and what happens over the next 30 years unravels almost everything the jury was told. Fingerprints at the scene belong to no one ever charged. DNA sits untested for decades. The state's key witness is later confirmed to have been a paid informant, hidden from the defense for 30 years. A co-defendant, speaking years afterward, tells a different story entirely. None of it has been enough to stop what comes next. In a matter of weeks, the state of Tennessee intends to carry out this sentence. Attorneys are still filing motions. A clemency petition sits on the governor's desk. 3 people once sentenced to death themselves, and later proven innocent, are speaking out, asking him to stop it. So the question this case leaves behind is simple, and it does not go away. If a man defends his own life in court, alone, and the evidence against him keeps falling apart for 30 years afterward, how sure does sure need to be? Welcome to The Crime Vault. This case involves graphic content. Viewer discretion advised. Comment where you're watching from. And to everyone who's liked, shared, or subscribed before, thank you. It's how these cases keep reaching people. Here's exactly how it started, and how close it came to never being questioned at all. February 24th, 1994, North Memphis. By nightfall, 3 people who had been seen going about ordinary lives that afternoon were gone. Marcellos Anderson, 21 years old, known around the neighborhood as Cello, was the first to vanish. His mother, Dioise Anderson, 43, disappeared alongside him. So did Frederick Tucker, just 17, a teenager who had grown up close to the Anderson family and spent much of his time with Marcellos. The 3 of them weren't strangers thrown together by chance. Dioise was Marcellos's mother, and in the small stretch of North Memphis where they lived, Frederick was practically part of the household. The kind of friend who was around so often that neighbors stopped distinguishing between family and company. When people later tried to reconstruct that day, the picture that emerged was of 3 people who knew each other well, moving through a normal Thursday, with no indication that anything was wrong. Then, nothing. No phone calls, no sightings, no word from any of them. Family members noticed the silence almost immediately. Dioise was not the kind of mother who disappeared without telling someone where she'd gone. Marcellos, whatever else was said about him later, kept in regular contact with people who cared about him, and a 17-year-old simply not coming home was, on its own, enough to alarm his family. Missing person reports were filed. But in a case with no immediate witnesses and no bodies, there was little for investigators to move on, beyond the fact that 3 people who knew each other had vanished on the same day. Days passed. Then a full week went by with no answers, no ransom demand, no contact of any kind, just an absence that grew heavier with each passing day. It was that silence that eventually pointed investigators toward Rose Hill Cemetery, where the search for answers would take an unexpected turn. What they found there would change the nature of the case entirely, shifting it from a missing persons investigation into something far more complicated, one that would take 30 years, and counting, to even begin to resolve. For the family members left behind, that week of not knowing would become the first of many long, unanswered stretches in a case that was only just beginning. What happened next would set in motion a chain of witness accounts, physical evidence, and investigative decisions that are still being scrutinized today. The break in the case came from people who saw something, not from anyone who came forward on their own. On the afternoon of February 24th, 1994, the same day Marcellos Anderson, Dioise Anderson, and Frederick Tucker were last seen, witnesses recalled a Jeep Cherokee moving through the neighborhood with more people inside it than usual. Investigators would later place Marcellos and Frederick in that vehicle, along with 2 brothers from the area, James Montgomery and Jonathan Montgomery. That same evening, the group arrived at the home of Nikita Shaw, the Montgomery brothers' cousin. According to her later account, the group went down into the basement together. A short time afterward, James Montgomery came back upstairs alone and told her to leave, saying he needed to take care of some business. Shaw didn't ask questions. She said afterward that something about his tone told her not to. She left the house that night, and whatever happened in that basement after she walked out the door became one of the central unanswered points investigators would spend years trying to reconstruct. Physical evidence gathered from the property added weight to her account without fully explaining it. Investigators recovered fingerprints inside the house believed to be connected to the abduction, along with a blood-soaked cloth. Both would become critical pieces of evidence, not because they immediately pointed to a suspect, but because of who they didn't match. The fingerprints lifted from that house were never linked to anyone eventually charged in the case, a detail that would follow this investigation for the next 3 decades. For a week, the case sat without a body, without a confirmed crime scene, and without a clear direction. That changed when Jonathan Montgomery, one of the 2 brothers seen in the Jeep Cherokee that night, led investigators directly to Rose Hill Cemetery. He took them to the exact plot where Marcello's, Deoy's, and Frederick had been buried beneath an existing casket. It was Jonathan's cooperation, not forensic work or a tip from an outside witness, that turned a missing persons case into a triple homicide investigation. That cooperation didn't last. Before Jonathan Montgomery could stand trial himself, he was found hanged in his jail cell. His death meant one of the few people who could speak firsthand to what happened that night in the basement of Nikita Shaw's home was gone, before he ever had to answer for it in court. It also meant that whatever knowledge he carried about the roles played by the others involved died with him, leaving investigators, prosecutors, and eventually defense attorneys to work from second-hand accounts and physical evidence alone. With Jonathan Montgomery gone, the case moved forward against 2 remaining men, James Montgomery and Tony Von Carruthers. But the foundation investigators built the case on was already showing its first cracks. Unmatched fingerprints, a blood-soaked cloth with no confirmed source. A key witness who had led police to the grave, now unable to testify to anything at all. These were not small gaps. They were the beginning of a pattern that would define this case for the next 30 years. Physical evidence that never quite closed the loop, and answers that depended more on who was willing to talk than on what could be proven. If you're the kind of viewer who wants the investigation broken down this closely, the evidence, the timeline, the gaps nobody talks about, this channel puts out deep dive procedural breakdowns like this every week, and subscribing means you won't miss the next one. What came next moved the case out of the neighborhood and into a courtroom, where the 2 men left standing would face charges that could cost them their lives. With Jonathan Montgomery gone, the state moved forward against the 2 men left standing. James Montgomery and Tony Von Carruthers were arrested, indicted, and each charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. These were the most serious charges Tennessee law allowed. If convicted, both men faced the death penalty. The case against Carruthers rested heavily on one man, Albert Shaw. Shaw testified that Carruthers had arranged the killings, tying him directly to the deaths of Marcello's Anderson, Deoy's Anderson, and Frederick Tucker. Alongside Shaw's account, prosecutors built a broader narrative, that Carruthers had orchestrated the abduction to remove Marcello's as competition in the local drug trade. Carruthers denied it from the start, maintaining he wasn't present at the scene, and had no connection to what happened that night. Before the trial even began, the case took a turn that would shape everything that followed. In the months leading up to it, Carruthers went through 6 different court-appointed attorneys. Some he dismissed himself. Others, he said, were working against him rather than for him. When his legal team asked the court to appoint a 7th, the request was denied. The presiding judge ruled that Carruthers would represent himself. Carruthers had documented mental health issues at the time, a fact the court was aware of. His attorneys would later argue this played a direct role in his decision to dismiss counsel, that it wasn't a clear-headed choice to go it alone, but a symptom of a mind already struggling to trust the people meant to defend him. The court disagreed, ruling that proper procedure had been followed, and that it wasn't obligated to keep appointing new attorneys indefinitely. So the trial proceeded with Carruthers defending himself, alone, in a case where the only possible outcomes included death by execution. He cross-examined the state's witnesses. He challenged the prosecution's version of events. By nearly every account, including those of the attorneys who represented him afterward, he wasn't equipped for the task in front of him. That became clearest during the testimony of the medical examiner, Dr. O.C. Smith. Smith testified that the 3 victims had still been alive at the time they were buried, a claim that carried enormous weight with the jury. Carruthers never challenged it. He called no expert to dispute the finding. He didn't cross-examine Smith on that point at all. The jury heard one of the most severe claims in the entire case, with no one in the room pushing back against it. On April 26, 1996, the jury convicted Tony Von Carruthers, on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. At sentencing, prosecutor Bobby Carter addressed the jury directly, telling them that if these murders didn't qualify for the death penalty, then none ever would. The jury agreed. Carruthers received 3 separate death sentences, 1 for each victim. For the state, the case was closed. A jury had heard the evidence, weighed the testimony, and reached a unanimous decision. For Carruthers, a 30-year fight was just beginning. What almost no one in that courtroom could have predicted was how much of the evidence behind that verdict would eventually come apart. Fingerprints that never matched, DNA that was never tested, and a key witness whose credibility would later be called into serious question. The conviction that sent Tony Von Carruthers to death row was about to be tested in ways no one in 1996 saw coming. A verdict is supposed to be the end of a case. For Tony Von Carruthers, it was only the beginning of a much longer fight, one that would slowly expose how little of the physical evidence in this case ever actually pointed to him. Start with the fingerprints. Investigators had recovered them from the house where they believed the abduction of Marcellos Anderson, Diois Anderson, and Frederick Tucker took place. In the years after the trial, those prints were compared against everyone charged in connection with the case. They didn't match Tony Von Carruthers. They didn't match James Montgomery. They didn't match anyone the state had ever accused. Someone had been inside that house whose identity has never been established, and that fact alone became one of the most persistent threads in Carruthers' post-conviction appeals. Then there was the DNA. An unidentified male DNA profile was recovered from fabric found in the grave alongside the victims. For years, that profile sat untested against the one name that could have meant something: Ronnie Irving, known on the street as Eyeball. Irving was killed in 2002, but his DNA and fingerprints remained on file, available for comparison. The testing was never done. Courts weighing requests to compare that evidence reasoned that even a match to Irving wouldn't conclusively clear Carruthers, since it wouldn't rule out more than one person being involved. To Carruthers' legal team, that reasoning missed the point entirely. A match would have at least confirmed a name the state had never pursued. The medical evidence didn't hold up any better over time. At trial, Dr. O.C. Smith's conclusion that the victims were alive when they were buried had gone unchallenged, delivered to a jury with no opposing expert in the room. Nearly a decade later, in 2005, forensic pathologist Dr. Cleveland Blake reviewed the same evidence and reached a different conclusion, testifying that in his professional opinion, the 3 victims were already dead before they were placed in the ground. Not long after, Dr. Smith himself stepped back from his original finding, no longer standing firmly behind the claim that had shaped the jury's view of the crime in 1996. 2 of the jurors who convicted Carruthers would later say that they would not have voted for the death penalty had they heard that information at trial. The next blow to the state's case came from inside the crime itself. In 2011, James Montgomery, Carruthers' co-defendant, gave a statement to an investigator that broke sharply from the story the jury had been told. Montgomery said Carruthers had no part in the kidnapping or the murders. He said he had carried out the abduction himself, and that he had directed Ronnie Irving to take Diois Anderson. It was the first time anyone directly involved in the crime had placed responsibility elsewhere, and it came from a man who had once stood beside Carruthers as a co-defendant in the very case that sent him to death row. Courts have weighed that statement carefully. Montgomery was, by that point, a convicted murderer who had already accepted a plea deal, and his account came years after the fact, long after the trial that determined Carruthers' fate. Judges reviewing the claim have not found it sufficient, on its own, to overturn the conviction, but for a case already carrying unmatched fingerprints and untested DNA, it added one more name, one more version of events, and one more reason for doubt to keep circling this file. Perhaps the most damaging revelation came last. Albert Shaw, the witness whose testimony had tied Carruthers to the killings in the first place, was for decades presented to the jury as a man with no stake in the outcome beyond telling the truth. In August 2024, 30 years after the trial, the state disclosed documents confirming that Shaw had been a paid confidential informant at the time he testified, a detail never shared with the defense. Reporting on the case has also noted that Shaw recanted his claim about Carruthers in a television interview, only to reverse course again and return to his original account after being threatened with a perjury charge. The jury in 1996 never knew any of this. They heard Shaw's word as fact. Taken individually, any one of these issues might be dismissed as a loose end. Taken together, they form a pattern that has followed this case for 30 years. Evidence that was never tested, testimony that was never fully disclosed, and a co-defendant's confession that pointed the finger somewhere else entirely. None of it has been enough, in the eyes of the courts, to overturn the conviction, but all of it has been enough to keep this case from ever feeling finished. And as you're about to see, the legal fight over these very questions was still playing out in courtrooms, right up until the moment Tennessee prepared to carry out Carruthers' execution. If you want to see exactly how that fight unfolded, subscribe now, because the next part of this story moves fast, and you won't want to miss what happens before the state's plan reaches its final hour. As Carruthers' case continued moving through appeals, a new legal question emerged, one that had nothing to do with the physical evidence and everything to do with his state of mind. In February 2026, his attorneys filed a motion arguing that he could not legally be executed. They pointed to a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type, and described a man whose grip on the legal process around him had become deeply distorted. According to his attorneys, Carruthers believed his execution date wasn't real at all, but a pressure tactic meant to push him into giving up his legal rights. He had reportedly called the federal public defender's office as many as 300 times in a single day. The legal standard for this kind of claim comes from two Supreme Court rulings, Ford v. Wainwright in 1986 and Panetti v. Quarterman in 2007. Under those decisions, a person cannot be executed if they are unable to rationally understand the connection between their crime and their punishment. In March 2026, a Memphis judge ruled that Carruthers did meet the threshold for competency, finding that he understood his conviction and the sentence attached to it. That ruling was appealed to a higher court, and the question of his mental state remained unresolved as the execution date drew closer. At the same time, a separate legal battle was unfolding over the evidence itself. In April 2026, attorneys with the ACLU filed an emergency motion with the Tennessee Supreme Court, asking the court to order DNA testing on evidence that had never been examined. Their argument was straightforward. Comparing that DNA against the alternative suspect named years earlier by Carruthers' co-defendant could be critical to determining whether the right man had been convicted. The Tennessee Supreme Court denied the motion, reasoning that even a match elsewhere would not, by itself, rule out Carruthers' involvement in the crime. The ACLU took the fight to federal court, continuing to press for testing that had never once been carried out in 30 years. Outside the courtroom, pressure was building from a different direction. A clemency petition was submitted to Governor Bill Lee, asking him to halt the execution. A public petition in support of Carruthers gathered roughly 30,000 signatures. 3 people who had once been sentenced to death themselves, and later exonerated, spoke publicly on his behalf. Ray Cohn, of Arizona, Sabrina Butler Smith, and Dum Alatani, of Memphis, held a press conference, urging the governor to intervene before it was too late. Amnesty International went further, calling the planned execution a violation of international human rights standards. Through all of it, prosecutors and state officials held their position. The conviction was lawful. The appeals process had been thorough. The sentence should be carried out as scheduled. On May 21, 2026, the state of Tennessee moved forward. At Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, preparations for the execution began on schedule. Media witnesses were brought in and seated in a room adjoining the death chamber, waiting for the process to begin. But inside that chamber, something went wrong. Medical personnel were able to establish a primary IV line, but could not establish the required backup line called for, under the state's execution protocol. When they attempted to insert a central line instead, that attempt failed as well. With no way to proceed within the protocol, the execution was called off. Shortly afterward, Governor Bill Lee released a statement granting Tony Von Carruthers a temporary reprieve from execution, lasting 1 year. It was an outcome no one on either side of this case had predicted. For 30 years, every appeal, every motion, and every request for new testing had been denied. In the end, it wasn't a court ruling or a governor's decision that stopped this execution. It was a failure to find a vein. That failure has reopened questions this case has never fully answered. The fingerprints still don't match. The DNA still hasn't been tested. The informant whose testimony helped convict him is still the same man whose credibility has since come apart. And Tony Von Carruthers is still on death row, 1 year further from an answer, not closer to one. Whether that year brings new testing, a new ruling, or simply a new execution date remains to be seen. If you want to know the moment this case moves again, subscribe now, because when it does, we'll be the first to break down exactly what it means.